At Arizona State University, we're bringing world-class education from our globally acclaimed faculty to you. Earn your degree from the nation's most innovative university. Online. That's a degree better. Learn more at asuonline.asu.edu. At Arizona State University, we've made online education better, smarter, and more personalized so you can go further in your aspiring field.
I decided to pursue medicine once I realized that ASU did have the online program for biological sciences. You're still required to learn the same curriculum. You're still being tested on the same content that anyone would be tested on in person. The comprehensiveness of the program prepared me so well for medical school.
Explore over 350 plus programs at asuonline.asu.edu.
Calaroga Shark Media.
In the year 336 CE, Pope Sylvester died after presiding over the most dramatic transformation in the papacy's history. The office he left behind bore little resemblance to the one he had inherited 22 years earlier. Where his predecessors had led an illegal religion from the shadows, Sylvester had become the bishop of magnificent basilicas, the recipient of imperial patronage, and the leader of a church rapidly becoming the empire's dominant faith. But as his successors would discover, this transformation introduced new challenges alongside its opportunities. Once theological disagreements became matters of state policy, doctrinal disputes took on political dimensions that drew popes into complex power struggles throughout the empire. The papacy now operated in a religious landscape where emperors convened councils, exiled uncooperative bishops, and sometimes imposed their own theological preferences, regardless of ecclesiastical opinion. Today we examine how the post-Constantinian papacy navigated these new challenges, particularly through the Arian controversy that dominated 4th century Christianity. We explore how popes asserted authority in doctrinal disputes, how they positioned themselves between competing theological factions, and how they developed more explicit theories of Roman primacy. This is the story of how theological conflicts shaped papal power after Constantine's revolution. This is White Smoke, Episode 21, Theology and Power. As Christianity moved from persecuted sect to imperial religion, theological disputes took on new political dimensions. The most significant of these was the Arian controversy, a complex debate about Christ's nature and relationship to God the Father that dominated 4th century church politics. Named after Arius, a priest from Alexandria, whose teachings emphasized Christ's subordination to God the Father, the controversy quickly spread throughout the Eastern Empire and eventually to Rome. Constantine, concerned primarily with church unity rather than theological precision, convened the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE to resolve the dispute, resulting in the famous Nicene Creed affirming Christ's full divinity. For the papacy, this controversy created complex challenges. Pope Sylvester sent representatives to Nicaea, but did not attend personally. His successor Julius more actively asserted Roman authority in the ongoing dispute, providing refuge to Athanasius of Alexandria, the leading anti-Arian theologian who had been exiled from his see. Julius's support for Athanasius represents an important assertion of papal authority in doctrinal disputes, explains Dr. Julius I, Professor of Catholic and Historical Theology at Durham University. By welcoming the exiled bishop and declaring his deposition invalid, Julius claimed a right to intervene in Eastern ecclesiastical affairs based on Rome's apostolic authority. This assertion met significant resistance from Eastern bishops, who rejected Julius's intervention as unwarranted interference. The resulting tension revealed fundamental differences in how Eastern and Western churches understood authority. Western tradition increasingly emphasized Rome's primacy based on its connection to Peter, while Eastern tradition emphasized the collective authority of bishops and the special status of all apostolic sees. The controversy grew more complex under Pope Liberius, who faced direct imperial pressure when Emperor Constantius II, who favored the Arian position, demanded he condemn Athanasius. When Liberius refused, he was exiled, and an anti-pope, Felix II, was installed in Rome. According to some accounts, Liberius eventually compromised and signed a semi-Arian formula to secure his return, though the historical details remain contested. The Liberius episode reveals the papacy's vulnerability to imperial pressure despite its growing institutional strength, notes Dr. Geoffrey Dunn. When papal positions conflicted with imperial priorities, popes could still face exile or deposition, demonstrating the limits of church independence in this transitional period. This complex interaction between theology and politics continued under Pope Damasus, whose election occurred amid violent conflicts between his supporters and those of a rival claimant, Ursinus. Damasus eventually secured his position with imperial support and firmly aligned the papacy with the Nicene position against various forms of Arianism. Under Damasus, papal claims to primacy became more explicit and theoretical. His confidant Jerome famously articulated the principle that the Church's salvation depends on the dignity of the high priest, the Pope, whose judgment carried universal authority. This developing theory of papal primacy, though not yet fully elaborated, laid foundations for later medieval claims of universal jurisdiction. The Arian controversy thus served as a crucible for developing papal authority, through the complex negotiations between theological principle and political reality. The papacy gradually defined its role as both doctrinal arbiter and institutional leader, establishing patterns that would shape its subsequent development for centuries. Pope Damasus perhaps best embodies the transitional papacy's complex development. His pontificate consolidated many elements of the post-Constantinian papal model and established patterns that would define the office for centuries to come. Damasus's controversial election itself reflected Christianity's changing status. Two factions supported different candidates, with Damasus representing those more closely aligned with the imperial court and secular elites. Violent clashes reportedly resulted in over 100 deaths before Damasus secured his position with imperial support, a stark contrast to the community-based selection processes of earlier periods. Once established, Damasus systematically enhanced papal prestige and authority. He extensively renovated and monumentalized martyrs' shrines throughout Rome, creating pilgrimage destinations that emphasized the city's sacred character. His famous inscriptions at these sites explicitly linked Rome's sanctity to its apostolic foundations in Peter and Paul, thereby reinforcing papal claims to special authority. Damasus effectively created a sacred topography for Christian Rome, explains Dr. Marianne Sagi, historian at Central European University. By developing martyrs' shrines and connecting them to apostolic authority, he established a spiritual geography that paralleled and ultimately superseded traditional pagan sacred sites. This physical transformation symbolized Christianity's new cultural dominance. Damasus also strengthened institutional structures. He regularized the system of tituli, churches distributed throughout Rome's regions that administered sacraments and charitable services. He enhanced the role of deacons in administering church properties and charitable programs. He established more formal protocols for communication between Rome and other churches, laying groundwork for what would later develop into the papal chancery. Perhaps most significantly, Damasus articulated a more explicit theory of Roman primacy. Working with his secretary Jerome, he promoted the concept that Rome possessed unique authority based on its connection to both Peter and Paul. In correspondence with other churches, he increasingly presented Roman positions as normative rather than merely advisory, expecting compliance rather than merely consultation. Damasus represents the crucial bridge between the persecuted and imperial church, notes Dr. Geoffrey Dunn. While maintaining continuity with earlier papal traditions, he fundamentally reimagined the office for a new context. The institutional structures, cultural productions, and theoretical claims he developed would shape the papacy throughout the subsequent millennium. This reimagining wasn't merely pragmatic adaptation, but but reflected theological conviction that the Church's new status manifested divine providence. For Damasus and many contemporaries, Constantine's conversion and Christianity's subsequent rise represented God's validation of the faith after centuries of persecution. This triumphalist interpretation justified the Church's embrace of imperial partnership and cultural authority as fulfillment of its mission rather than compromise. Yet Damasus's pontificate also reveals continuing limitations on papal power. He failed to resolve ongoing schisms within the Roman community itself. His authority was still largely confined to the Western Church, with Eastern bishops often resistant to his interventions, and he remained dependent on imperial support for maintaining his position, revealing the papacy's continuing vulnerability despite its growing institutional strength. Under Damasus and his immediate successors, the papacy developed administrative practices and theological positions that would define the office for centuries. Several key innovations illustrate this transformation. The papal decretal. Pope Siricius, who succeeded Damasus in 384, issued what is considered the first papal decretal, a formal document giving directives to other churches with an explicitly legislative character. Addressed to Bishop Hymerius of Tarragona in Spain, this document not only answered specific questions, but established general rules for church governance. Unlike earlier papal letters that primarily offered advice or mediated disputes, Siricius's decretal assumed authority to establish binding church discipline. Its tone and format resembled imperial rescripts, suggesting conscious modelling on imperial administrative forms. This documentary innovation created a textual basis for expanding papal jurisdiction beyond Rome itself. Doctrinal development. The papacy increasingly positioned itself as the final arbiter of doctrinal disputes. When theological controversies arose, not just Arianism, but questions about the Holy Spirit, the relationship between Christ's human and divine natures, and various sacramental practices, popes issued authoritative statements that claimed to represent the authentic apostolic tradition. Pope Innocent articulated this role explicitly, stating that major controversies should be referred to Rome for definitive judgment, because Peter's authority continued through his successors. This claim, though not universally accepted, particularly in the East, established a precedent for papal doctrinal authority that would develop further in subsequent centuries. Liturgical standardization. The post-Constantinian papacy increasingly standardized liturgical practices, both within Rome and gradually throughout the Western Church. Archaeological and textual evidence shows more uniform church layouts, altar arrangements, and ceremonial elements emerging during this period. Papal practices became models that other churches increasingly adopted or adapted. This liturgical influence extended beyond formal worship to the church calendar, saints' commemorations, and sacramental procedures. While regional variations persisted, the Roman pattern increasingly functioned as a normative reference point, enhancing papal cultural authority alongside institutional power. A representative system. As the Church expanded geographically and organizationally, popes developed systems for extending their authority beyond Rome. Papal legates, representatives with delegated authority, began appearing at councils and courts throughout the empire. Bishops in certain regions were designated as papal vicars, exercising oversight on the Pope's behalf. Pope Celestine developed this system further, establishing more formal protocols for papal representation and delegation. These arrangements extended papal reach without requiring the Pope's personal presence, creating administrative connections that bound distant churches more closely to Rome. Petrine theology. Throughout this period, popes increasingly grounded their authority claims in the Petrine theory, the concept that Christ had given special authority to Peter based on Matthew 16, that passed to his successors as bishops of Rome. This theological position, elaborated by popes and their supporters, provided religious legitimation for expanding papal jurisdiction. Pope Leo developed this theory most systematically, arguing that Peter lives and exercises judgment in his successors. His famous sermons asserted that the Pope acts not just as Peter's representative, but in some sense as Peter himself, exercising the apostles' divinely granted authority in each generation. These innovations collectively transformed the papacy from local episcopate to trans-regional authority, establishing foundations for what would later develop into the medieval papal monarchy. While implementation remained inconsistent and contested, the conceptual framework for expanded papal authority was firmly established by the late 5th century. Just as the post-Constantinian papacy reached new heights of institutional development under figures like Damasus and his successors, external events dramatically altered its context. In 410 CE, Rome was sacked by Visigothic forces under Alaric, the first time in nearly 8 centuries that the Eternal City had fallen to enemy forces. This traumatic event, while not directly targeting the papacy, fundamentally shook Roman self-understanding and challenged Christian claims that imperial adoption of the faith had secured divine protection for the empire. Pope Innocent I was temporarily absent from the city during the sack, but returned to a physically damaged and psychologically traumatized Rome. The sack of Rome represented both practical and theological challenges for the papacy, explains Dr. Michel Salzman. Beyond physical destruction of churches and disruption of ecclesiastical administration, it raised profound questions about divine providence and the Church's relationship to imperial power. If Christianity couldn't protect Rome itself, what did this mean for the faith's claims? These questions intensified as the Western Empire continued its slow collapse throughout the 5th century. Successive popes faced deteriorating political conditions, reduced financial resources, and increasing pressure from Germanic kingdoms, establishing control over former imperial territories. The institutional structures and authority claims developed during the Constantinian period now faced severe practical tests. Pope Leo navigated these challenges with remarkable skill. When Attila the Hun threatened Rome in 452 CE, Leo famously met him near Mantua and somehow persuaded him to withdraw. Though later accounts embellished this meeting with miraculous elements, it demonstrated the Pope's emerging role as Rome's defender when imperial protection failed. 3 years later, when Vandal forces under Genseric captured Rome, Leo again negotiated with the invaders. Though unable to prevent the city's occupation, he reportedly convinced Genseric to refrain from massacre and burning. These diplomatic interventions established precedents for papal political action independent of imperial authority, a role that would expand as imperial power receded. Leo's actions during these crises reveal a fundamental transition in papal self-understanding, notes Dakota George Demacopoulos. While still theoretically acknowledging imperial authority, the papacy increasingly acted as an independent power when necessary. This practical independence, forced by circumstances, laid foundations for later medieval developments in papal temporal authority. This evolving relationship with secular power paralleled developments in theological authority. Leo's famous tome, addressing Christological controversies, presented papal pronouncements as definitive interpretations of apostolic tradition, while his sermons explicitly connected papal authority to Peter's primacy among the apostles. In both practical governance and doctrinal leadership, Leo exemplified the fully developed post-Constantinian papacy, adapting to a world where imperial support was increasingly unreliable.
What if everything you've been taught about happiness is wrong? We chase careers, approval, more stuff, hoping it'll finally make us feel fulfilled, but it never sticks. What if happiness isn't out there, but already inside you, just waiting to be unlocked? Discover the book, The Happiness Experiment. Every person has a unique happiness type, and when you understand yours, everything shifts. You'll stop chasing and start creating joy on your own terms. Discover your happiness type with a free happiness type assessment. Go to myhappinnesstype.com. That's myhappinnesstype.com. It takes just a minute and it might change your life. Then grab your copy of The Happiness Experiment at Books A Million. This isn't just a book, it's a practical framework, a journey inward. It's a tool to help you reconnect with the happiness that's been waiting inside you all along. Pick up The Happiness Experiment and start your happiness experiment today.
By the late 5th century, the papacy had undergone a second transformation, nearly as significant as its initial emergence from the catacombs under Constantine. From being a client institution dependent on imperial favour, it had become increasingly self-reliant amidst imperial decline. The institutional structures, theological positions and authority claims developed in more favourable circumstances now enabled the papacy to navigate a world where Roman imperial power was collapsing in the West. The papacy that emerged from the post-Constantinian period was fundamentally different from both its persecuted predecessor and its early imperial form, observes Dr. George Demacopoulos. The Pope remained the Bishop of Rome and leader of its Christian community, but now operated with expanded institutional resources, more explicitly articulated authority claims, and increasing practical independence from imperial oversight. This transformed papacy carried both enhanced capabilities and new challenges into the subsequent period. Enhanced prestige and organizational development enabled greater theological, liturgical, and administrative influence throughout Western Christianity. But closer identification with Roman civilization created tensions with the Germanic kingdoms that increasingly controlled former imperial territories. The papal revolution of the 4th and 5th centuries thus established patterns that would define the institution throughout subsequent history. The tension between spiritual mission and institutional power, the balance between independence and political partnership, the relationship between Roman particularity and universal claims, the integration of humble Christian origins with grand imperial forms. As the Western Roman Empire completed its collapse in 476 CE, this transformed papacy would face new challenges that would test both its imperial adaptations and its developing independence. Its capacity to navigate these challenges, preserving essential continuity while adapting to radically changing circumstances, would demonstrate the enduring significance of both its underground origins and its imperial transformation. White Smoke is a production of Calaroga Shark Media, portions of which were made with the help of AI narration.
From the creators of Palace Intrigue, a new chapter in royal history begins. William and Kate's wedding captures the world's attention, but royal life isn't as perfect as it seems. Tensions rise as Harry meets Meghan, sparking a divide that will shake the monarchy to its core. From explosive interviews to family scandals, the royal family faces its most public challenges ever. As King Charles takes the throne, the future of the monarchy hangs in the balance. Family secrets, royal rifts, and the future of the crown. Crown and Controversy, wherever you get your podcasts.
There's always something brewing behind palace walls, whether it's Prince Harry and Meghan Markle making headlines from afar, or Prince William and Princess Catherine quietly preparing for the future throne. I'm Mark Francis, and on Palace Intrigue, we cover every twist, turn, whisper, and wink. From royal drama to daily gossip, follow Palace Intrigue wherever you get your podcasts.
You know the silhouette, the squint, the voice that cuts like a blade. Clint Eastwood isn't just a movie star, he's a myth, a mayor, a cultural fault line, and maybe the last great American icon. Eastwood Reloaded tells his story one chapter at a time. The hits, the flops, the chaos between the scenes. Because legends aren't born, they're built. Eastwood Reloaded. Listen now wherever you get your podcasts.